pray with me. Come, Holy Spirit, and kindle in us the fire of your love. Rain down on our dry, dusty lives and hearts, our weary souls. God, may the seeds planted in us, the seeds of your life and your grace, may they be given your water. Grow in us your spirit, your truth, your peace. God, move among us today. Nourish us, change us, move us, touch us, transform us. Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. This psalm is one of my favorites. I love the imagery at the end of God's rain softening the earth and making things to grow. And how beautiful is this? You crown the year with your goodness. Your paths overflow with rich food. The valleys decked out in grain, they shout for joy, they break out in song. This psalm, like many psalms, many other scriptures too in the Bible, presents praise for God's goodness felt and known through creation. Ancient people at that time understood the world to be kind of set up like a snow globe, that when God separated the sky from the land and the waters from the land, that the water and sky were sort of pulled up and made into this dome above us all. This dome was sort of held fast at the edges, and you can kind of hear that in this psalm, by the mountains. That there were windows in this dome that God would open to send down the rain to nourish the earth. We understand, of course, all these things differently than the ancients did, but you can imagine that they were rooted and connected to the reality that without water, without rain, there would be no crops, and thus there would be nothing. There would be no life at all. This psalm is beautiful, and it confronts us in a world that maybe isn't exactly like that. God, who is abundance, who gives the gift of water, of life, of plants that we can eat, is in contrast with the world that we live in, a world marred by our own sin, right? Where there are places that consume more water than they have, places that don't have enough water, that have to ration water, people who have to buy water. I mean, we have water bills, right? But it's nothing like in other countries where water is super scarce, where the tap only flows at certain times of day, if at all. I studied abroad in Mexico, and I lived with a well-off family, but even they, you had to negotiate when you could take a shower, wash dishes, wash clothes, because water was scarce, had to be paid for, had to be watched and rationed out. I thought about the gift of running water recently. We were in Bloomington, when I was supposed to be in Scotland, right? We talked about that last week. But we went to see my father-in-law in Bloomington. He lives really kind of out in the country, not actually in Bloomington. They had a big storm, and the power went out. Thankfully, they bought a generator a year or so ago. But they said, when the power goes out, it's not just that the fridge stops working and the air stops working in the summer, but since they live in the country, they don't have water either because they're on a well system. So when there's no power, the pump that makes the well work doesn't work either. So there is no running water. And in the winter, they had a power outage before they had gotten the generator, and they have to go down to their creek. Fortunately, they have a creek at the bottom of their driveway, bring up buckets of water in order to flush the toilets. I don't know if you've ever had to do that in your life, to manually flush a toilet. I have, but it's a good life lesson for anybody who doesn't know. If your toilet's not flushing, just pour a bunch of water and down it will go. Anyway, these are really creature comforts from our modern industrialized world, but still the gift of running water, of flushing our toilets, of having safe, clean water to drink, of having rain that comes more or less when we need it to make agriculture happen. We take these things for granted. God is a God of abundance. God has given us all that we need if we could just trust that and rest in that. So I was thinking about creation care and this psalm. I was thinking about so many things, right? That we take the gift of water for granted, that we as a population, as a world, don't treat water as a human right, which it should be, I think. That God promises abundance, but maybe we don't really trust in that abundance, or even worse, we abuse that abundance. God provides. Now, in some streams of the Christian tradition, people think that because God provides and God's in control of everything, we don't have to worry about all the details of how we care for the world. Why bother thinking about how much water we use, for example, because God will just send more water. It will all be okay. And yes, there is God's abundance, but I think that that's an abuse, maybe, of trusting God's provision. Because while God provides, God also says, you are to be caretakers of all this. You are part of the world. Our neighbors need us to pay attention, and not just our people neighbors, right, but our animal and plant and fungi and all that stuff, all of the other creatures that are our neighbors as well. That maybe is a false resting in God's abundance, to think that because God will provide, what we do doesn't matter at all. Instead, I think God calls us to receive God's goodness and abundance and to treat it carefully as the gift that it is. Another interesting thing about this psalm, maybe you noticed, is this first part about God and praise and prayer and wrongdoings. It seems a little different, right, than the rest of the psalm where it talks about God's goodness and provision in creation. But I was struck by one of the verses, verse 4. We are filled full by the goodness of your house, by the holiness of your temple. Other translations use that filled full language and refer to satisfaction, that we are satisfied by God. And there's also a translation difference in the verb there. I'm going to throw a big word out at you just for fun. But the Hebrew actually has that filled full, we are filled full. It's a cohortative verb. I don't really even know what that means, but the alternate translation, the other way of sort of looking at it is, We are filled full, we are satisfied. The alternate is that cohortative means it's sort of a supplication or a wish or a future kind of a hope. May we be satisfied by the goodness of your house, the goodness of God. May we be satisfied. We live in a culture and a time, as we talked about earlier in the prayer of confession, when we are not satisfied, right? We talk about this all the time, the drive to consume more, to get more, to achieve more, to be more. Our economy runs on constant growth, and I don't think it takes a genius to figure out that eventually we will use up all that is. Like in the Dr. Seuss book, The Lorax, right? When eventually they cut down all the, truffula trees, and there is barren wasteland. Without thinking about the future, without sort of responsible stewardship, thinking about the long-term horizon, that is what will happen to us. God is a God of provision, abundance, and joy, but there are limits, right? The natural world is not endlessly full of resources. God calls us to stewardship, to right relationship with God and the land and our neighbor. See what I'm saying? We need to seek that satisfaction, that enoughness, that resting in God and what we have, both for our own individual lives and as a community and a country and a world. I find it hard to rest in satisfaction and in contentment. Part of what I think is hard about it is all the voices around us saying we need this, we need that. Lydia, my daughter, who's 8 years old, this summer has gotten it into her head, unfortunately, that she needs a Stanley Cup. Have you heard about this trend? Okay, I think they are good and they keep your ice for a long time. I'm not hating on Stanleys for anyone who's into them, but we have at my house a lot of those kind of travel cups and water bottles. I mean, literally, there's a whole cabinet of them. We do not need a special cup because it is called a Stanley Cup, because that's the cool thing, right, with the kids. And again, kids, I see them laughing at me. Yes, I know it's fun and cool to be on trend. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. Just, it's an example of sort of this hamster wheel we all kind of live on of stuff and things. And how do we get off of it? How do we find contentment? How do we find contentment? Contentment maybe doesn't offer the dopamine boost in our brain that new stuff does, right? We are wired, I think, to have that dopamine reaction to new things, to novel things. You know the feeling when you go and you've saved up and you go buy something fun and, ooh, it feels so exciting. And then, you know, a couple days later, it's like, right? And yet we keep doing it. I think that sort of hamster wheel is our whole culture, our whole lives. How do we practice something different? How do we practice that enoughness, that contentment? How do we trust that there is enough to go around and enter into the stewardship and the care that we are called to? We sort of parcel out and hold back the goodness of God, the goodness of the earth, and also our maybe trust and love for others. There is enough. Another pastor I saw posted on Facebook in response to the incident last night where President Trump was shot and said, we can pray for our enemies if they are our enemies or not. Wherever we fall, we can pray for all of those whom we disagree with. Violence, of course, is never the answer. We don't have to be desperate enough for any answer to our political conundrums to resort to that. God is the God who sends the rain to water the earth for things to grow, and so we can offer our prayer and compassion. And when we don't feel like we have any more, when we're sort of chasing something else to fill our lives on the hamster wheel of contentment in our life, we can step off. So maybe that's the practice. The way to seek more contentment is to picture ourselves, maybe you're a visual person, stepping off the hamster wheel, looking around and giving thanks. Gratitude, of course, is one of the doorways to God and God's presence. So I invite you into that this week, to practice satisfaction, to practice God's presence. As the psalmist says, may we be satisfied by the goodness of your house, by the holiness of your temple.